Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. The Exiles of Babylon conference is filling up with registration. If you would like to attend the conference April 3rd to 5th, 2025 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, all the information is at theologyintheraw.com. Sign up sooner than later if you plan on attending live because the registration is going pretty quickly. You can also attend from your living room via live stream. Okay, my guest today is Professor Nancy Pearcey, who is the author of several awesome books, including Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, Total Truth, which if you're watching on YouTube, this is Total Truth. I talk about this book at the beginning of our conversation together. And then her most recently released book, which is called The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, which is the topic of our conversation today. This is an absolutely fascinating book. If anybody mentions the term masculinity, I know it gets really triggering for some people. It's like, well, what's she going to say and everything? Wherever you're coming from with this conversation, it is a stimulating, very well-researched book that will challenge you on many levels. Professor Pearcey is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the top 5 women apologists by Christianity Today. And the Economist called Nancy Pearcey America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. So I am very honored to talk to Professor Pearcey. I've been following her work for many years now, and so it was a delightful conversation, and I think you will very much enjoy it. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Professor Nancy Pearcey. I am so excited to talk to you, Nancy. Thanks so much for being a guest on Theology in the Raw. We've been trying to make this work for a while, and we finally found the time to make it work. I was telling you offline, I came across your name at the beginning of my teaching career back in the late 2000s when I was wrestling with how to integrate a Christian worldview into all areas of life. And I was trying to teach my students it, and I was like, I don't quite have it figured out. And so I didn't really teach it well. But then your book came out, I think, right before my class that I was teaching called Total Truth. Liberating Christianity from its cultural captivity. And it was a game changer in my life. Not only did it really revolutionize my thinking, but I was like, I can give this to students because it's such an engaging book. They can understand it. And every chance I got, I assigned it to my students there at Cedarville University. So thank you for that book. Thank you for being a guest on Theology in the Raw.
Oh, thank you.
You have a very interesting story. For those who don't know who you are, as far back as you want to go, at least to L'Abri, how did you go from being an atheist to now being a Christian public intellectual figure that's writing just really amazing books?
Well, I was raised in a Christian home, but it was a Lutheran home. And I don't know if you know this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran. And so it's more ethnic. It's kind of like, all Irish or Catholic. And so it's more of an ethnic background. And when I was in high school and attending, secular public high school, all my teachers and textbooks are secular, I started asking questions. How do we know it's true? Really, just one question. How do we know Christianity is true? And unfortunately, none of the adults in my life could answer that. My parents were kind of like, well, you're Swedish. What else are you going to be? Or to be precise, I asked my father one day, point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me.
Oh, wow.
I said, but that's it? He was a university professor. I really thought I'd get more. And then I talked to one of my uncles who was a seminary dean, Concordia Lutheran Seminary. And all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes. Like it was a psychological phase. And I eventually decided, about halfway through high school, I decided that if you don't have good reasons for something, you shouldn't say you believe it, whether it's Christianity or anything else. And I obviously was not getting good reasons from the adults in my life. So I very intentionally walked away from my faith at about age 16. I decided it was up to me to find out what's true. Where can I find a worldview to live by? And that's how I started studying philosophy, because I thought, well, isn't that their job? Right? To ask questions like, what is truth? How do we know it? Is there meaning to life, purpose to life? Is there a foundation for ethics? Or is it just true for me, true for you?
Yeah.
And I realized pretty quickly that if there is no God, the answer for all of those is no. No, there's no meaning to life. We're just on a rock flying through empty space. I was the one in my friend group who was arguing for moral relativism, telling people you can't say that's right or wrong. We don't know right or wrong. I even decided that there was no foundation for knowledge. In other words, skepticism. Here's how I thought of it. I'm 16, but the way I think of it was, if all I have is my puny brain in the vast scope of time and space and history, what makes me think I could have access to any sort of universal, objective, transcendent truth? Ridiculous. That's how I thought of it. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had really absorbed all of these isms. And from my science classes, I'd become a determinist, because we're just complex biochemical machines anyway, with no free will. So I was prime, for ending up at L'Abri, because it was only an apologetics approach that would work with me, because I had thoroughly absorbed all of these secular isms. And it was a few years later, I went to Germany. We lived in Europe when I was a child. And so I had saved my money all through high school because I wanted to go back. And so that's how I ended up in Europe and sort of stumbled across L'Abri, which was the ministry of Francis Schaeffer. And if I find more and more people don't know him. So here's how I introduce him to my students. The two top apologists of the 20th century were Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
In terms of the sheer number of people who were converted through their work or brought through a crisis of faith. And so we should know them for that reason, for nothing else. We should learn from success. What did they do right? So I ended up being able to actually study under Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri. And, I didn't become a Christian at first. L'Abri was so attractive because I'd never met Christians who were smart, who could engage with the secular isms that I had absorbed by that time. I didn't know any Christians who could talk on that level. And who not only could they answer my questions, but they knew the questions better than I did, right? Yeah. Because they had studied the same secular worldviews and knew what the problems with them were. So actually, I stayed a month the first time. I stayed a month and then I fled. I just needed to get away. I was afraid I might be drawn in emotionally. And Christianity had let me down once before. So I was not going to be drawn in emotionally. I was not going to do this unless I was intellectually convinced it was true. And so I went home, but because of that, I had learned about apologetics. I never knew such a thing existed. So I studied all of Schaeffer's books and Lewis and Chesterton, and Os Guinness had written his first book by that time as well. At any rate, eventually I decided I did know enough to be intellectually convinced that it was true. And then I thought, where do I find other Christians? Because I wasn't in a church or anything. I was just reading on my own. And I thought, I knew some back at L'Abri. So a year and a half later, I went back to L'Abri and stayed several months. And that's when I really got grounded in Christian worldview and apologetics and so on. And so it's marked all of my writing, all of my speaking, all of my teaching. That's all I want to talk about. I love to help young people who have questions like I did, right?
Okay.
We always want to help the people who had the same problems that you had when you were young. And so that's why it's all of my books and teachings and are on apologetics today. And a lot of it's cultural apologetics. Because, what was unique about Schaeffer is unlike, sort of purely classical apologetics, which is, logical arguments in the ether. He looked at how ideas percolate down through a culture, through art and literature and music. And you still have to know the same isms, but you're looking at how they're expressed through cultural means. And so that's what is unique about his approach. And that's what we teach, by the way, at Houston Christian University. We're the only Christian university that offers a degree in cultural apologetics.
Really? I did not know that. You guys are getting I feel like every time I turn around, you're getting a new awesome scholar professor at Houston Christian University. It seems like it's becoming, it's been, but it's becoming even more of a go-to place to study.
Other universities have a course or two in cultural apologetics, but we actually offer a degree.
Yeah. Which I think in this day and age is more effective. That's the questions when I'm around younger people or skeptics or even people inside or outside the church, it typically has to do with a cultural issue that is driving a wedge between them and Christianity. It's not the existence of God kind of things, and as much as maybe it used to be. You found that to be true as well?
Oh, I agree. I totally agree with you. Yes. And well, I have to agree because that's what worked for me. I would never have been drawn in by William Lane Craig. My
Yeah.
older brother became a Christian before I did, and he tried to draw me in with historical arguments for the
Oh, yeah.
resurrection.
Yeah.
And and one day he asked me point blank, he said, "Okay, do you think Jesus was from the dead?" And a mutual friend was standing there who said, "Well, that's the crux of it, isn't it?" And I said, "No, it's not. It could be a wonderful parable that makes some people feel good." So I was already totally postmodern. Like, who cares about facts?
Yeah.
And Schaeffer addressed the postmodern young person because he lived in Europe, where postmodernism hit, earlier than it did
Yeah.
in the States. And
Yeah,
so he was
sure.
already addressing postmodern
Huh.
people, which apologists in the States were not doing that. And I think that's
Right.
why it appealed to me. I was completely postmodern already.
Interesting. I remember that I was like a few months into the faith when I was working at a restaurant as a food server, and there was this kind of like hippie, white Zen Buddhist Hindu guy, that I was talking to, and I raised that same question. I was like, so if Jesus rose from the dead, though, what are you gonna do with that? And his response was, "Hey, he probably did rise from the dead. Happens in Hinduism all the time. People come back from the dead, talk to people, chill, go back. It's like, yeah, that's no big deal." Is Christianity good and beautiful for the world? He didn't put it in those terms, but that was kind of his hang up, which has to do with kind of the cultural beauty or lack thereof of Christianity in some ways. So,
Well, that's
um,
exactly the type of student who used to come to L'Abri. I was there in 71, and so it was all hippies,
yeah,
and people would come to the States, come to Europe, left the States, come to Europe, traveled to India,
yeah,
studied at
yeah.
an ashram. So that's the kind of student who ended up at L'Abri in those early years. It was really quite fun.
And it's you said it's different now. Have you been back? I mean, in recent years, or
Well, the year and a half between my two visits, you could already see a change.
hmm,
Here's how I would put it. Before that, it was news of L'Abri was mostly word of mouth, and so the type of student who came was mostly intellectually seeking non-Christians.
okay,
They were mostly non-Christians when I was there, the majority. But then in between, his books came out. His first books,
yeah,
God Was There and Escape from Reason, and he began to be known in the Christian world. And so,
hmm,
even in the year and a half between my two visits, there was a noticeable change as it became much more emotionally troubled Christians. Because a
okay,
lot of Christian young people have doubts about their faith because of emotional issues and conflicts with their parents, and especially, pastors' kids and missionary kids. And so, it took several years for L'Abri to say, "Well, what do we do about this?" The sort of apologetics approach we were using is not working as well, and so
yeah,
they noticed that there was a difference. So it has taken L'Abri a while. I'll tell you, I have not gone back to the Swiss L'Abri, but I've been invited to speak at their national conferences. Every time I wrote a
oh,
book,
yeah,
I get invited to speak at a conference. And when I wrote Finding Truth, so after Total Truth, I wrote
yeah,
Finding Truth as sort of a follow up. And that year, they actually labeled the conference Finding Truth
mm.
after my book and said, "Oh, good, apologetics is finally coming back." you know,
Oh
so
wow,
that
interesting.
they
Yeah,
began to focus on apologetics more again. Um,
okay,
what happened with the shift for a while, they started defining their ministry as hospitality. And
okay,
so many of us who read Schaeffer's books and thought he was about apologetics went to L'Abri and said, the apologetics isn't really strong anymore. And so
interesting.
I think they've tried in recent years to come back a little bit more to, you know, finding out that some of Schaeffer's key insights really do work.
Hmm.
Like in the book Total Truth, I talk about how one of Schaeffer's key insights was concept of truth has changed. And that as a result, when we say to people Christianity is true, they
Hmm.
no longer mean the same thing by the
Hmm.
word true.
Hmm.
And so we're talking right past them. And so half of his message was training Christians to understand that the secular view of truth has changed. And if we
Hmm.
want to be effective in communicating, we need to learn the secular language. I mean, our job is to be missionaries, right? Missionaries don't expect the natives to learn their language. It's the missionary's job to learn the natives' language.
Right.
And so if we're missionaries, it's our job to learn the secular worldviews and the secular language so that we can talk to them in words that they understand.
That's good. That's good. Oh man, I could talk to you all day about the old days of L'Abri. It sounds so exciting. I'm a little jealous that I didn't get that experience. But let's fast forward to your latest book, The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Very provocative title, and it was different than what I was expecting. I'm not sure I know what I was expecting, but this is such an incredibly good book. And why don't we start with what led you to want to write this book? I mean, it's talking about masculinity and toxic stuff is highly disputed in this day and age. I'm sure there's a backstory to why you wanted to write this book, and then we'll get into the content.
Well, you're right. It's very controversial. And what has surprised me is that it's been the most controversial book I've written. Because my earlier book, Love Thy Body, was on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism. I thought that would be my most controversial book.
Yeah.
But masculinity is even a greater trigger word, apparently.
Yeah.
It's I've been attacked relentlessly on Twitter, for example. But I think the reason I wanted to write it is because I was a feminist for many years, and I was still coming to grips with masculinity myself. So in my book, I do start with the story of my own father, who was severely physically abusive. Right. And I mean, he wouldn't say, "Do this, I'll spank you." He'd say, "Do this, I'll beat you." I mean, he's quite open about it. And he would use his fist. I mean, his favorite was the knuckle fist with the middle finger slightly extended to cause a sharper stab of pain. So I grew up in terror, and watching my siblings get beaten too was very difficult. And so when I became a young adult, of course, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism, right? I always had some feminist book on my bedside table, and I thought they were wonderful. And then I became a Christian, and I had to start rethinking the whole thing. And, since we started with L'Abri, let me tell you an aspect of L'Abri that I don't usually mention. On staff was a psychiatric social worker. And of course, she couldn't see everyone who came through. So she would pray, and God would tell her.
Wow.
God would tell her who was going to come see her. So the first day, people said, "Oh, you should go talk to her." Her name was Sheila Bird. Her nickname was Birdie. And so people said, you should talk to Birdie. She's cool. Well, I was there just a short while. I'll talk to anybody. And then I found out she was a psychiatric social worker. I didn't know that at first. But when I came in to her office the first time, she said, "God told me you were going to be coming." And I was not a Christian, so that freaked me out. But the upshot was she was willing to be on staff because she did know that a lot of people's issues with Christianity are not just intellectual, but also emotional. Mm-hmm. And in talking to her, I did realize that it wasn't just that I had intellectual questions, which I did. And what I appreciated about Schaeffer was that he took them seriously. Other Christians had acted like, if you have questions, there's something wrong with you. What's wrong with you? You don't have faith. Or maybe you have some sort of a moral problem. You just want to party on Saturday nights, right? Yeah. and no, actually, I just did have honest intellectual questions. But through Birdie, I was able to see that I also did not want Christianity to be true because of my father. I did not want to be anything like my parents. And if they were Christian, I was not going to be, know. So that helped me to realize that I also had an emotional barrier to Christianity as well. So what was cool about that, Preston, is that from the very beginning of my Christian life, I had both a very rich intellectual understanding and Christian worldview, but I also had a very rich psychological, spiritual healing, from day one of my Christian life. And because my father's abuse was so severe, I have to tell you, it's taken my whole life up until this time to really get to the point where I could write about it in this book. So as I put it in the introduction, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life. So that's really the reason I wanted to write it. Is in a sense, it was me making sense of my own background all the way back to childhood.
Wow. One of the most helpful things early on in the book is, and you did this in Total Truth too, if I remember correctly. Yeah, you did. The difference between the family in the pre-industrial age versus post-industrial age. Can you unpack that for us? And just the husband wife relationship with kids, and I mean the family structure we live in now in a post-industrial Western era is just so different than a pre-industrial age. And I think this is helpful as we try to enlist the Bible to endorse a certain view of the family today. We just have to be really cautious and thorough in doing that. So paint a picture for us: pre-industrial family, post-industrial family.
Well, you're right. I have one chapter on it in Total Truth. But back then I was still thinking mostly of the impact of the Industrial Revolution on women because I was still, that had been my background, feminism. But in this one, I went back and realized, hey, you can make sense of men and the expectations on men and the changing definitions of masculinity if you go back to the Industrial Revolution. Because most people think, where does the concept of, that masculinity is toxic? Where does that even come from? And most people will think, well, 1960s, second wave feminism. But actually, it starts back in the Industrial Revolution. And here's how we have to set it up. Before the Industrial Revolution, fathers worked all day with their families, people they loved, their wives and children on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so there was a much closer relationship between men and their families back then. And as the social expectations on men were different too, because they focused more on their caretaking role, their responsibility to be gentle and patient and loving with their children and their wives. Of course, early America was also more Christian. So there was a stronger sense of a Christian calling on men. Even secular historians will say things like the colonial definition of masculine virtue was, quote, duty to God and man. So it's fun, because secular historians have to acknowledge that there was a really strong Christian understanding of masculinity until the Industrial Revolution. So what does that do? It takes work out of the home into factories, but men have to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, men were not working alongside people they loved and had a moral bond with, right, their wives and children. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. That's a very different environment. And already in the 19th century, you start to see the literature change. This is when you start to see criticism saying the male character is changing. Men are becoming individualistic, acquisitive, greedy, to use some of the language of the day, self-centered, assertive, aggressive, and turning work into an idol. It was fascinating how often I saw that language in the 19th century literature. Is instead of using work as a way to support your family. I mean, you weren't supporting, you were working with your family. Now you're working, if you're working alone, it's much easier to start treating work as a way for individual achievement and professional success. And so there were a lot of critics in the 19th century who said men are starting to turn work into an idol. As starting to take the place of their religious loyalties. And especially fathers, by the way. We're so used to be having fathers out of the home all day that we think that's just normal. But in the 19th century, there was a huge outpouring of literature of people lamenting the loss of the father in the home. They felt like the home had been hollowed out because the father was just not physically present all day as he used to be. So 1842, try to give you some specifics. Parents Magazine had an article in which he said, the greatest source of domestic sorrow these days is father absence. That the father works late, he toils early and late and has no time to fulfill his duties to his children.
Oh, wow.
Another one said, the way our Industrial Revolution has set work up, the mainstay of the home, the father, the central figure is no longer even there. And the head of the women's Christian temperance movement, who, by the way, many people say was the most influential woman of the 19th century, put it this way. She said, the major issue of our day is father absence. And we think that happens much later, but they were absent from the home physically, even though they were technically still living at home. She said father absence, and here's how she put it. The prototype of the divine is the father. And yet he's absent from his home, from Sunday to Sunday. So, the family no longer has a prototype of the divine. The model of the divine father is no longer there from day to day in the home. And it affected girls to some degree, but at least girls still had the mother in the home as a model. It really affected boys. And so sociologists, psychologists write things like, one historian says, for the first time, boys experienced an identity crisis. That language became popular in the 60s. But it really started when fathers were out of the home and boys no longer had that connection to the adult male world. A psychologist at the time in the 19th century put it this way. He said, never before has the American boy been so wild. And the reason is, he said, he's half orphaned. Wow. His father's gone, from day to day. So he's half orphaned. And so people began to comment on how boys were becoming wild and unruly and unmanageable. And we think, oh, boys will be boys. Haven't people always said? No, they began to say that in the 19th century when they noticed that boys' behavior was growing worse because fathers were not there to supervise them. Pretty soon, boys were interacting only with women, the mothers, female teachers, female Sunday school teachers. And so boys were growing up without a close relationship with any male figure. And so a lot of I guess the way we get from there to today. What happened when those wild, unruly boys grew up? They brought that behavior with them. So the 19th century is known for being a century where there was a great increase in crime, in gang activity, drinking, prostitution. And that's why there were so many reform movements in the 19th century, because men's behavior was growing worse. And so a lot of the negative stereotypes that we have of masculinity came from that 19th century era. And to really counter it, we need to go back and see where it came from and how it developed.
That's fascinating. And as you're talking, I'm reading your book. And honestly, that part of your book is worth the book as a whole. That'll be my last sales pitch. I'm not getting paid to say this. Like that alone, I just remember reading through all that, and I was like, man, this is a kind of a game changer. The thing it made me think of, because my expertise is more in like ancient, the biblical world, but it's still pre-industrial, and it's same thing. You had oftentimes men and women either on the farm or at the shop, and in the city, working alongside each other. And there isn't this harsh there's a division of labor, so to speak, but it's not separate from each other. It's all integrated. There's an Old Testament scholar, Carol Myers. I had her on the podcast, and she's done a lot of work in the significance of bread making in the ancient world, that this was a tedious 3 to 4 hour daily task, and 70% of people's caloric intake came from bread. And she talked about, she's not even a Christian, but she was saying like women had a lot of agents. The whole idea of like patriarchal culture, it's like isn't quite accurate, because yes, there was kind of male authority and all this stuff, but women carried a tremendous amount of agency. In fact, if she wanted to pull the plug on bread making and nobody else knew how to make bread, and this was an arduous task, and the men, yes, they may have been out in the fields, but nobody would say, oh, the men's going off to work, or the woman's not doing any work. She might be tending to the children, like she was doing that as well. But everything was so much more integrated.
You're right. Yeah. All you have to do is read Proverbs 31, for the Old Testament version. Here's a woman who's running several businesses, right? Running a large household, has a lot of servants, and selling things in the marketplace and buying fields and so on. And by the way, I read this didn't make it into the book. I had to cut somewhere. But Martin Luther's wife was an awful lot like the Proverbs 31 woman.
Oh, interesting.
She was buying land. She was buying orchards. She had a brewery, if I can say that right, making beer.
Brewery, yeah. Brewery. I knew about that.
she had several businesses, as well as a former nun, discussing theology. with Martin Luther. And, they didn't have a lot of professional journals back then. So often theologians would get together by going to each other's homes and actually visiting for several weeks. And so she was known for, being able to stay right with, these professional theologians because of her background as a nun. Luther called her Doctorissa, meaning, female doctor.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He's Herr Dr. Luther, but she was Doctorissa because she was so well known. And even National Geographic had a fascinating article on her in which he said, even at the time, a lot of people felt that Luther was getting a lot of his ideas from her, which may be true. But anyway, wow. The pre-industrial era. Even colonial America. I read historians on colonial America saying the same thing. It's okay. Legally, women did not have the same rights that we have today, but there was a kind of equality just because of their indispensability. You could not run a household without women's contribution, and that gave them a kind of power, which they lost after the Industrial Revolution, when household labor was not valued and not as important. And so women doing household labor experienced a huge devaluation in their position.
That's interesting. So there was more of a value, even more power and agency ascribed to women pre-industrial age, and then post-industrial age, as society is quote unquote progressing. We're actually regressing a little bit in how society is viewing men and women.
And this is how you understand the feminist movement. It's because there were genuine losses. Yeah. Twofold. One, women lost access to interesting and creative work, because it wasn't just men's work that was taken out of the home, so was women's work. Like you said, bread making was an arduous, hours-long task. So was weaving, cloth making, spinning, making fabric was equally arduous as bread making. And of course, women often had the garden and raised the chickens and churned butter and made candles. And, there's a whole host of household manufacture that women were in charge of. And that was interesting and challenging. Yeah. Well, those all left the home. What happened to women? Women were stuck with early childcare and cleaning. I mean, was not, you can see why that was not as intellectually challenging. And so, and also because they had lost the indispensability of their labor, they did experience a huge decrease in their morals and their status. One of the ways you see that is if women were to ask their husbands to contribute to the household, that was no longer seen as valid. She was nagging. She was a shrew. That language was not really used very often before that. You hear it a lot in the manosphere today, right? That women are shrews and they nag. And but when women were an equal part of the household and they asked their husbands to contribute, that wasn't seen as illegitimate. It was only afterwards, when she no longer had as much moral authority, that it was seen as illegitimate. And the feminist movement itself, this is what I was writing more when I covered the Industrial Revolution in Total Truth, is I wanted to show how it had had an impact on women. Dorothy Sayers has a wonderful quote about this. She said, all this wonderful, interesting work that women used to do as part of their household manufacture was taken away. She said, even the dairymaid in her simple bonnet has been replaced by a male mechanic in a milking machine. So, women lost something, definitely. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well if we want to have an effective counter to feminism, is that we have to acknowledge that women did lose something in the Industrial Revolution.
This episode is brought to you by Jatasa, an organization that offers bookkeeping and accounting services exclusively for churches and nonprofits. So the name Jatasa simply means the spirit of serving others. And with over a decade of experience and clients across the U.S., Jatasa helps nonprofits and churches of all sizes manage their bookkeeping, accounting, taxes, and CFO services. So with Jatasa, you can outsource both your bookkeeping and accounting services or just one of these. Either way, you can be confident that Jatasa will provide professional services designed to meet your nonprofit's specific needs. From reconciling accounts to compiling financial statements, Jatasa's accountants will help your nonprofit or church regain control over your finances, reach your goals, and plan for growth. And I love the key values of Jatasa: graciousness, conscientiousness, thoughtful integrity, and a commitment to community impact. And these, of course, align with the values of Theology in the Raw as well. Also, Jatasa, for what it's worth, is Theology in the Raw's first local sponsor. Jatasa is based in Boise, Idaho, which I'm super stoked about this. But their services, extend all across the country, so you don't need to be based in Boise to take advantage of Jatasa. So if you head over to Jatasa, just tell one of their team members that Preston at Theology in the Raw sent you, and you'll get the first month of services for free. Okay, so just head over to jatasagroup.com. That's jatasagroup.com, or just click on the link in the show notes and tell them Preston sent you, and you'll get your first month of services for free. Hey friends, if Theology in the Raw has blessed or challenged you in any way, would you consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/Theology in the Raw? We are actually revamping our bonus material that Patreon supporters get. So we are going to 2 bonus Q&As per month for all the different paid levels. Silver level gets access to ask questions for the Q&A episode, and also you will get access to Exiles in Babylon archived content, which will be releasing different videos every month. Also access to bonus research episodes that I'm gonna record from time to time. Access to rough drafts of certain things I'm working on, which is a little scary for me to let people look into that because it's a rough draft. Gold and Gold Plus members get, we have monthly Zoom chats and all the other perks that the other tiers get access to as well. So again, if you want to support the show, it really, really does help us to flourish as a ministry. Again, patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. I will see you in the community. Quick question. I want to move on to kind of an adjacent point. So would you say that it would be anachronistic? And maybe I'm throwing you this, maybe I'm answering my own question, but I kind of want to hear you say it, or at least see if I'm on to something. I mean, that this, in the modern period, this, if someone says it is biblical for the man to go off and work and the woman to stay home with the kids, like that's the black and white. If a woman is not doing that, if the man's not doing that, that is a violation of biblical principles? Or how would you, is there a biblical model of the family that is mandated today, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think those people are living in the 50s.
Okay.
They're living in the 50s. They think they're being traditional. They're not being nearly traditional enough. You need to go back before the Industrial Revolution if you want to get at what was traditional for millennia. Most of human history. Men have worked in the home and its outbuildings. You know, if they were a blacksmith, it was connected to the home. You know, if they were professional men, like lawyers and doctors, usually had an office in the home. So that has been the model for most of human history. Today is the anomaly. Since the Industrial Revolution, that's the anomaly. So I would like to see us find ways to reconstruct as much as we can a greater sense of a pre-industrial work style. For example, the pandemic was a game changer. Yeah. Because a lot of men got a chance to work from home. And the Harvard University actually did a study. It's not in the book because it came out after my book. But they did a study, and the conclusion of the study was, during the pandemic, 68% of American men said that they got closer to their children, and they don't want to lose that. Wow. That they want to continue some kind of hybrid arrangement, work from home, flexible hours. They want some way of tweaking the industrial workplace so that they can have more time at home. Yeah. And so, and by the way, of course, you've got to convince the CEOs as well. So in my book, I have several quotes from CEOs who said things like this. One of them put it this way: before the pandemic, we were very suspicious, very hesitant about any sort of remote work. And then he said, the pandemic has completely exploded those fears. We did not see any drop in productivity. So I tell people, take these quotes to your boss and make the argument that having a more flexible workplace and maybe having some days at home, a hybrid situation. I quote people who've done studies and who say allowing men time to be better fathers actually makes them better workers. They may not put as much time in, like staying overtime and coming in on weekends because they value their family. Yeah. But the time they do put in is more productive. That's what the studies are showing. And so I would like us to see ways in which we could maybe bring work home. I've written about this for women for a long time, but about 60% of women who are home with children do now have work that they do at home. They either run a business or they have some sort of remote work. It's a lot larger than you would think. Most women who are home with children are contributing to the family income. So they're, in a sense, recreating the pre-industrial lifestyle where their work and their family is more integrated. Yeah. And now it would be nice to see if men can also do that so that they can have the benefit of being closer to their children.
Pre-pandemic, my wife, my family entered into that. Like, so, we run a nonprofit, and the Theology and Raw has become its own kind of LLC ministry. Both my wife and I work full time for both. We both work from home, and our kids have been either homeschooled or the last several years they've been doing more online school, but still at home. So there is no 9 to 5 in our house. It is just integrated. In fact, like yesterday, my wife and I woke up, we built a fire. The kids were gone, studied. They went to a coffee shop to do some of their homework. My wife and I were both working with our laptops on different couches next to the fire. We were getting work done, but we were also like, we kind of would remember something funny from yesterday, say it, and then talk about something here, and then go back to work, whatever. And it was just all integrated. And I would say in the last several years, it's been, I might come up for lunch and then do the dishes really quick because they're messy. And then my wife might do the same thing, or, it's just everything is much more integrated, and our division of labor is based more on skill set. So there might be something I'm better at that. Okay, that's my job, and something she might be better at. And some of them fall along the lines of traditional gender roles, but some don't. Like, my wife actually loves to build stuff. She loves power tools, and so we and I can manage that world too, and I could jump in, but she a lot of times if there's something that needs to be like built or something, like she'll go do it. I would normally feel threatened by that physically, but now I'm like, she enjoys it. In some ways she's better at it than I am, and I don't feel less masculine if I'm doing the dishes. And there's other areas that we might fall into more traditional gender lines. But when I was reading your book, just that integrative role, I'm like, man, we have kind of fallen into that. And it's been some of the most beautiful moments in our family. It really has. And I hate even saying that because I know some people maybe would want that, and for various reasons they don't or can't have that. So I don't, I want to take that into consideration.
Well, I want to encourage people to try, because sometimes I've gotten the response of, oh yeah, you're writing for the laptop class, because they can do that. But I have known women, for example, who have pink collar jobs. Pink collar is the counterpart to blue collar. For example, a friend of mine who has a hairdressing salon in her basement. One chair, and she cut my hair recently, and she had glass doors so we could watch her kids playing in a fenced-in backyard. She had her eye on her kids while she fixed my hair. And that's a pink collar job. And for the most part, you'd think, well, you can't do that because that's hands-on. That's not a laptop. Or another friend of mine on the male side. So he ran an auto shop. Well, you'd think, well, he can't do that at home. Right? But you know what? He could do his bookwork at home. Yeah. So instead of staying in the office, he's staying in the shop to do his bookwork. He would take his bookwork home and sit around the kitchen table while his kids were doing their homework, so that he could answer questions and he could discuss what they were learning. Yeah. And so the way I put it in the book is this: not every job can be done at home, but aspects of almost every job can be flexible and can be done at home. And so I encourage people to think that way. It takes some creativity. Or another friend of mine was a scientist. Okay, nobody can afford a lab in their home. A lot of Christian universities can't even afford a lab. It's very expensive. But she hit on the idea of writing abstracts, working for an abstracting service, because nobody in a professional field can keep up with all the journal articles coming up. So most of them subscribe to an abstracting service where they can read short excerpts. So while she was home with her kids, she wrote abstracts. And by the time she was ready to start going back to work, she was hired like that because people knew she was up on the latest literature. She hadn't missed a beat. Even though she wasn't in the lab, she knew what was going on in her field. So there's lots of ways that you can be more creative if you really want to try to, recreate the closeness of like you said, the integrated family.
Yeah, that's good. I want to jump ahead to something in your book that it might be seen as controversial, but you argued the case well. You cited tons of data, and I hope I word it correctly. This assumption that modern day families that are more traditional, or I might even use the term complementarian in their theology, that these environments are more prone to foster abuse, sexism, a demeaning view of women. And you showed that the data doesn't really support that. Am I wording that correctly? And can you speak into that?
Yeah.
That was a bit shocking. I was like, wow. I mean, it's hard. I mean, given the data you're citing, it's hard to argue against it, but that's not the assumption today. In fact, I know people that say complementarianism is intrinsic to abusive households. And I'm like, I hope that's not true, but.
Well, the sociological studies were not done on complementarianism so much because that's a theological term.
Yeah.
And so the studies were done on theologically conservative men, is how they phrased it, or theologically conservative evangelicals. And yes, you are totally right. The media narrative is that if you hold any notion of male headship in the home, that will turn men into overbearing, oppressive, tyrannical patriarchs.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually an empirical claim. And so the sociologists and psychologists were listening to that and saying, well, is that true? We can test this. If you hold these beliefs, does it in fact turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical patriarch? And I cite about a dozen studies. And the one good thing about evangelical men being targeted is they got studied. So there's a lot of studies done on them. And you're right, to my own surprise as well. Okay, with my family background, with my abusive background, I was blown away. I had no expectation that I would find this. That the studies show clearly that men who hold theologically conservative positions actually are the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And of course, the first question I always get is, did they talk to the wives? So the answer is yes. These are large databases. Most of the studies were not done by Christians on, inventing their own surveys or questionnaires. They went with these large things like the General Social Survey, which, was 30,000 Americans from the University of Chicago. And so, in fact, yes, the wives were also being interviewed. And so the wives are the ones reporting the highest level of happiness with the way their husbands treated them. Evangelical men were more engaged with their children, both in shared activities and in discipline, like setting limits on screen time. They spend 3.5 hours more per week with their children than secular men. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And then, contrary to the narrative, they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. And sometimes a quote
quick,
can help.
Nancy, so these are secular studies, and that last stat you cited, that's narrative disrupting, that theologically conservative, or just say conservative men, that has lower levels of abuse than non-evangelical conservative men.
Let me finish with this point, and then I'll tell you. Then I'll give you the qualifications. There are some qualifications.
Okay, good. Yeah.
but and some of these, by the way, some of these researchers were Christian, and some of were not. For example, I'm going to give you a quote from Brad Wilcox. He's Catholic, and he's at the University of Virginia. But he is considered one of the top marriage researchers in the country. And he gets quoted. He gets invited to write articles for places like the New York Times and the Washington Post. So this is an article from the New York Times. Direct quote. He says, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives." Of course, they're focusing on the wives because the assumption is that the wives are the ones being oppressed. And then he goes, religious conservatives, fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his secular colleagues, because sociology tends to be a very secular field. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular, because Protestant evangelical men are the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. And so this isn't a pep talk from some religious leader. Right. These are evidence-based findings, and this is solid research. And we should be confident in bringing it both into our churches, because it's not there yet, and into the public square as well.
That's so fascinating. Have you gotten pushback on this? You said you got some pushback online or whatever. Most pushback online comes from people who haven't read the book, I'm sure.
Yes. You're right. Yeah. Well, the first pushback I always get is, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? In fact, I ran into a stat saying it is the most widely quoted statistic by Christian leaders. So obviously they're trying to motivate us, right? Yeah. By telling us we're failing. Yeah. But anyway, they went back to the data, and they did make one very important distinction between evangelical men who are really sincere about it, who attend church regularly, who are really committed, versus nominal Christians. Okay. And so nominals are those who are defined as, on a survey like this, maybe they do check the Baptist box, for example, right, but they attend church rarely, if at all. And these men test out shockingly different. They fit all of the negative stereotypes, the toxic stereotypes. The wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have a higher rate of divorce, even higher than secular men, 20% higher than secular couples. Oh, wow. And they have the highest rate of abuse and violence of any group in America. So Brad Wilcox, that same sociologist, wrote an article for Christianity Today in which he said, the most violent husbands in America, with "the" was italicized, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men. Wow. So that's what we're up against. That on the one hand, the public narrative obviously has been shaped more by these nominals. By the way, my students don't even know what nominal means. So I have to tell them NOM is Latin for name. So it means Christian in name only. But they're the ones who are, in a sense, shaping the cultural narrative. But the men who are actually committed and attend church test out extremely positive. And that is not in our churches yet. If you read my endnotes, you'll see that they're all journal articles from the academic literature. And so I have a graduate student who's a head of the women's ministry at a large Christian church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. I thought, okay, the tone of my book is no more scolding. Bring these positive findings into the Christian world to encourage men that on purely objective measures, they are in fact doing very well compared to the rest of the culture. And they should be encouraged, because what it means is that the data from the social sciences is showing that living by God's design actually does make for happier marriages and families.
Imagine that. Yeah. I'm curious, what do you think in this? Your title is obviously playing off of a common phrase, toxic masculinity. There's a lot of heightened awareness of toxic masculinity, and there has been a response to that, which I'm hearing you say, the answer to toxic masculinity is not no masculinity, it's reintroducing healthy masculinity. What's been the byproduct in your either opinion or your research on what's the results that we're now living in on this backlash against toxic masculinity? What is that producing?
Well, it's kind of split, right? On the one hand, there's sort of the feminized masculinity, where men feel as though they're being told to avoid toxic masculinity, you should be more like a woman. And a lot of men are picking up that language. When I told my class at Houston Christian University that I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Oh, wow. And so a lot of men feel that way. And then, of course, we have the opposite reaction, the manosphere and the Andrew Tate type of masculinity that's sort of exaggerated. And again, I heard from another graduate student who now teaches high school. And she said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook. I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school.
Oh, yeah.
So even young Christian men are being drawn into these online influencers. If we don't give them a positive biblical view of masculinity, they will be drawn into some other groups who are giving them a secular view. And by the way, let me tell you where the secular view comes, because that seems to have come out of nowhere. The Andrew Tate, where did he come from?
Yeah.
In my book, I'm an apologist, right? So my main goal is to show, why does the secular world get its view so wrong, right? Yep. I want to help people critique and respond to the secular world. And so I spent a lot of time showing step by step where the secular view comes from. And just to focus on just one, it's my favorite stage of the many stages I trace is the rise of Darwinian evolution. Now, this is somewhat surprising because we think that's a scientific theory, but it had a huge impact on secular views of masculinity. Because social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer said, the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would by necessity be ruthless, brutal, savage, predatory, and barbarian. This was his language. And so instead of urging men to live up to the image of God, they were urging men to live down to what they called the beast within. That was man's authentic nature. And that view is still common in secular culture. There's a book called The Moral Animal. It's not called social Darwinism anymore. It's called evolutionary psychology, but it's basically renamed.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Rebranded.
Social Darwinism got discredited, so they gave it a new name. But there's a book called The Moral Animal, best-selling, I emphasize, best-selling book. And the author says the human male is a possessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving men a booklet on how to have a better marriage is like giving Vikings a booklet on how not to pillage.
Oh, wow.
I thought, where does he get away with this? Well, it's the social Darwinist background that says this is the true nature. Or another one that was, it was an older book that was just reissued called Men in Marriage. And he has the same message. He says men are by nature violent, irresponsible, sexually predatory. And men's deepest yearning is not for wife and family, but for the open road, the motorbike, for the male group escape to a mode of immediate and predatory gratification. And I'm like, whoa, you think this is how God made men? No, this is a product of sin. This is a product of the fall. But partly because of the Darwinian influence, the message has been that this is the true male nature. And so this is the source of the manosphere. This, Andrew Tate didn't come out of nowhere. The intellectuals have been preparing the way for a century. And so, by the way, there's another influencer who is heralded in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate. Have you heard of him? Myron Gaines.
No,
Myron Gaines. Okay. He has a podcast called Fresh and Fit that's becoming very popular. It was Christian men who told me about him. So,
okay,
they're aware of him. But his tagline is, I help men transform from simps into pimps. That's his tagline. All right. So all that to say,
sounds very Andrew Tate-ish. Yeah.
We need to know where these ideas are coming from if we want to be able to counter them and help our young men. Like I said, the high schoolers who are being drawn into Andrew Tate, we have to help them to see this is coming from a very secular perspective and is not biblical.
It seems like Andrew Tate seems like the inevitable byproduct of if a society comes down too hard on men or neuters men, you either get a bunch of men with their heads down and bowed shoulders, scared to do anything, or the second they feel any spike of energy or testosterone, they feel ashamed or whatever, or you get a bunch of Andrew Tates, so people are like, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of being, people trying to suffocate me. And neither of those are really healthy responses. I think the Bible does, oddly enough, have a good prescription of what healthy masculinity looks like.
Well, even this is all the way back to the 19th century. Because that happened in the 19th century. After the Industrial Revolution, when men were no longer growing up on the farm, and hunting in the wilderness, and they were sitting at a desk all day, people did begin to be concerned that they were losing their masculinity. And a new word entered the English vocabulary, over-civilized. People began to be concerned that men were over-civilized. And what's worse is that in the process, women had been put on a pedestal and held up as the moral and spiritual leaders. And this was new. This was completely new. Again, it was the product of the Industrial Revolution. What happened is, after the Industrial Revolution, there emerged a sort of large public sphere, large factories and financial institutions and the university and, of course, the state. And people began to argue that values had no realm in the public sphere, that these large institutions should operate by, quote, scientific principles, unquote, by which they really meant value-free. Don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. And since it was men who were getting that secular education and working in that secular environment, they did become secular sooner than women did. And so
interesting.
What the church did is the church started then pitching their appeal to women and began to say, well, think about it this way. If values are kicked out of the public realm, where will they be cultivated? In the private realm, in home and church, where women still presided. And I have to tell you, many people think this double standard, women being morally superior to men, they think, well, that's just forever, right? No, this was brand new. No one had ever said this before. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it had been thought that men were morally superior. Here's how their reasoning went. The insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. In fact, the Latin root of the word virtue is vir, which means man. Man, as in the word virile. Manly, virile. Anyway, so virtuous, the word had overtones of manly strength and honor. So this was completely new in the 19th century, when people began to say, well, we'll make women responsible to be the moral guardians of society. And it was women who led a lot of the reform movements of the 19th century. Why? Because most of the reform movements were against what were sort of traditionally male vices, like crime and drinking and gangs and prostitution. And so there was kind of a male-female tension in those reform movements, because it was women trying to get men to behave, to quote one historian. Now, that's not my word. A historian said the bottom line was women were trying to get men to behave.
Oh, that's funny.
But that's when men started feeling like, at first they kind of went along with it. They said, okay, well, women are morally superior, so I should allow myself to be taught by my wife. I mean, you see this in the literature of the day. I'll give you an example. Ulysses S. Grant, since we all know him, he literally wrote a letter to his fiancée saying, I try to organize my life by what I think will please you. You are my angel. You are the one who, tells me right and wrong. I don't remember the exact words, but something like that. I govern my life by what I think you will approve. So at first, men kind of went along with it, but eventually, like you said, they began to feel beaten down. Like, well, wait a minute, why are we always the villains? Why are we always the bad guys? And so late 19th century, early 20th century, you do see already then sort of the manosphere, attitude growing, men starting to say, well, this is just who we are. You don't like it? This is why the social Darwinist line became so popular. You don't like it? Well, men are by nature brutal, savage, barbarian, so that manosphere message started in the late 19th century as well.
Wow, that's interesting. Gosh, Nancy. Do you have time for a couple? I've got some questions coming in from my Patreon community. Do you have a couple more minutes or?
Sure.
Okay, this one, this goes back to the whole theological conservatism versus complementarianism. I'm glad you made that distinction. You weren't talking specifically about complementarianism, but the question is, it comes from Teresa. She says, since the research is only looking at theological conservatism, do you think we can make strong conclusions on complementarian versus egalitarian complementarianism and marriage health, especially since some complementarians may actually make mutual decisions. You do talk about the mutual decisions in your book among complementarians. This idea of if you're complementarian, it's just top down, you know, rulership over the home. Practically, a lot of complementarians in your book said that's actually a lot more mutual than people might assume. But can you speak into what can we say anything about complementarianism versus egalitarianism within the marriage health or?
Yeah, so this, again, it blew me away. I was surprised. So I have 2 chapters on these sociological findings. And the second chapter is, well, okay, if theologically conservative couples agree with the notion of male headship, and not all of them do, but
Yeah.
the majority do. And
Mhm.
how do they define it, though? How do they live it out? And again, when I read the surveys and what men and women actually said,
Mhm.
you're right. They spoke very much in terms of mutuality and respect and agreeing with one another. And, if my wife disagrees, I'm not just going to charge ahead. Of
Yeah.
course, I'm going to stop and find out why she disagrees.
Mm.
When I use their own language that I extracted from all of these interviews, and I was, I've been criticized by egalitarians who say, well, the complementarians that you quote are actually kind of egalitarian, aren't they? Really? Really? and I'm like, look, I'm letting them define it.
Right.
This is how they define headship. Maybe it's not how you would define it. The people who reject the notion of headship may have a different definition of what they're rejecting. But if you read surveys of the people who say they believe in male headship, I say let them define it. That's
Right.
my goal. I'm being factual here. I want to let them define it. If they say they hold to male headship, how do they define it? And I was astonished. I just didn't expect them to describe it in such loving, mutual, respectful ways. But the people that they interviewed did, in fact, define it in ways that were very loving. And as far as the vocabulary, let me say parenthetically, on the vocabulary of complementarian versus egalitarian, like I said, that's not what sociologists were looking at. But I did point out why I was not using that language in the book. And the reason I didn't use it is because 2 of my main researchers said it didn't seem to make much difference. Yeah, you would think it would, right? You would think if you believe in egalitarianism that it would make a difference. But the first one was Brad Wilcox, who I've already mentioned, at the University of Virginia.
He's excellent, yeah.
And he said, here's how he put it, that the husband's gender theory does not seem to make a difference in how happy his wife is. In our studies, the husband's gender theory is not making a difference. A lot of these women are just as happy. In fact, he did one study of egalitarian marriages, and he said they weren't any happier.
Oh, wow.
They weren't any happier. We studied them too, and they weren't any happier. And the other expert I quote is John Gottman, who's not a Christian. He has a Jewish background, but he's considered the top marriage psychologist. Brad Wilcox is sociology.
Okay.
John Gottman is the top psychologist in the nation. And he said, we get people into our practice. Some of them believe the man should be in charge. Some of them are more egalitarian. And here's how he puts it. Emotionally intelligent husbands, I'm quoting him, emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the most important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. So again, no matter what your gender theory is, if you know how to convey honor and respect to your wife. And so I quote these 2 guys and I say, for that reason, I'm just not even going to engage in that debate because it does not seem to make a practical difference.
That's interesting. Gosh. Well, okay. Well, I'm taking over time. One more quick question. This is a great question to end on. What does the world have to gain by Christians encouraging our men to be men?
Well, I think the person knows the answer to that. But obviously, men have been the great builders of civilization, and we need to honor that and support that. I mean, obviously, the great musicians and the great composers and the great inventors and the great scientists and the great builders of cultures. A lot of it's been men, and I'm not saying that women couldn't have done that. It's partly a matter of time. When women are home with children, they don't have time. So a lot of secular people and even Christian people historically have concluded, well, women were not as smart. Women aren't scientists and composers and poets because they're not as smart. I don't think that's true. I think it's because they don't have time. Because especially in a pre-industrial age, when you didn't have birth control, women spent most of their adult life with children. They're pregnant, nursing, and a babe in arms, sometimes all three at once. Children on their back, two toddlers holding onto their skirt. They're not going to go into war, okay? Because they're not going to move quickly. So traditionally, of course, women have done work that is closer to home, that is compatible with raising young children. And they have not had the time to be the great scientists and the great builders of civilization, not because they don't have the intelligence, but because they haven't had the time. They're not the great statesmen. So I wanted to clarify, on the one hand, I don't think it's indicative of a difference in intelligence. But, this might be a good gateway into ending with, I think the Christian message to men should focus on the cultural mandate. Only about half my students have ever heard that term, so I have to explain it. The cultural mandate, it starts in Genesis, right? It's the verse that says, God has created the universe, he's created the animals, he creates the first human couple. And what is the first thing he says to them? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, subdue the earth. And be fruitful and multiply does not mean just the nuclear family, because anthropologists tell us all the social institutions grow out of the family, ultimately, the clan, the tribe, the village, the nation, and even individual social groups like you need a state, you need a marketplace, you need a church, you need a school. And so it really does mean build up all of the social institutions of society and the laws and constitutions that govern them. And subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. It's all the arts and sciences. Again, it usually starts with agriculture, but goes to mining and technology and building computers and composing music. One of my students said, oh, come on, composing music. I said, well, I play the violin. What's the violin made out of? Wood and the bow, horsehair. So all of the transcendent beauty we associate with music does start with harnessing the natural resources that God has built into creation. And theologians call it the cultural mandate because what it means is that this is pre-fall. This is not after the fall. Pre-fall, what was God's intention for the human race was to build cultures, build civilizations, and make history. And I think that losing this message, right now, our message is take Jesus into your heart, or, if you're a Christian man, you're basically told sit in a pew and sing and pray. And that's a very narrow, truncated view of what it means to be a Christian. We need to go back to the pre-fall. What did God originally create human beings for? You might say in sin, we got off the track. In salvation, God puts us back on the track. But what was the track? Pre-fall, what did God create us to do? And I think it's especially important for men just because, the biological differences between men are that men are somewhat more aggressive, more risk-taking. And I think they, even more maybe than women, benefit from the cultural mandate message because it speaks to their need to achieve, to accomplish, the drive to have an impact. So that's the answer to the question, what do we gain? Well, if Christian men took up the challenge of the cultural mandate, they would be living out Christianity in every area of life. And so they would be having an impact everywhere, not just in the church, but in every sphere of society.
Wow. Oh, that's a great word. Nancy, I want to hold up your book one more time, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. For those watching on YouTube, this is what it looks like. Came out a year ago, I think, right? It's been out for a bit.
Yeah, about a year.
I still have my ARC, my advanced reader copy, so it's not the official one. But anyway, thank you so much for your work on that and your pile of great books you've written, and really honored to have you as a guest on Theology in a Raw.
Well, I'm glad. This was wonderful to talk to you, and I knew you would be fun to talk to because you just have such a personal way about you. So
thank you so much.
I could tell that from reading your books. You have a very warm personality. So it was very obvious today that you're a lot of fun to talk to. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure, Nancy. Anytime.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.